All right, welcome everyone. This is our very first in a monthly series of webinars through the International Environment Forum. And we are privileged to have our founder here as our first speaker this evening or this morning. Arthur Dahl has worked for the UN for several decades running in various organizations. He's an expert on coral reefs, one of my favorites, and has authored many books on sustainability and most recently on global governance, which is our topic today. And we will keep the chat open if you have any questions for him, or you can just hold them till the end when we'll have ample time for discussion. Thank you, Arthur.
Well, thank you all for joining us this evening or this morning, this afternoon, or the middle of the night, or whatever it happens to be in this round world of ours. And let me share my screen so we can go to the substance of what I'll be sharing with you this evening, so you don't have to keep looking at me all the time. My computer's a little bit slow for this, so it'll take a minute or two to. Fine, can everybody see it? Can you still hear me?
We see it, yes. We hear you.
Okay, fine, thank you. Fine. Perfect, okay. So let me give a sort of a summary of what I'll be covering in this presentation. We'll start looking at some of the existential threats, including climate change, biodiversity loss, resource depletion, and mass population displacements that we're threatened with at the moment, and showing how these are interrelated problems that we can only manage effectively at the global level. But our present mechanisms for global governance, environment governance in particular, are woefully inadequate to the need for urgent action all around the world. And we keep hearing the urgency of these things, and yet we're not moving in the right direction. And in fact, the good efforts of some, and there are lots of good things going on, are neutralized, if not reversed, by the contrary actions of others. And so we've been developing recently proposals for global governance for the 21st century that could finally manage the necessary transition to sustainability while embodying the principles of world federalism and oneness of humanity. And in particular, I want to share with you this evening some of the recent guidance that comes from the Baha'i World Center about the challenges that we're facing, both directly from the Universal House of Justice and also Bahá'í International Community in their statement for the United Nations 70th anniversary that sort of laid the background for where we need to go as we address these challenges of governance, particularly at the global level. So I'll first depress you a bit with what's going wrong with the world, which always happens when we talk about the sustainability challenge and the existential threats that we're facing, like climate change, biodiversity loss, and why we have to find some ways of dealing with these as rapidly as possible. We of course know that when we look at sustainability, there are both inner boundaries and outer boundaries. This is Kate Wayworth's donut representation, where you have an ecological ceiling with outside of it climate change and chemical pollution and land conversion and biodiversity loss and so on, the limits we shouldn't go beyond. And you have the social file on the inside, where we have poverty and problems of food and education, where you have to respect the inner boundaries. And in between, find that safe and just space for humanity with a regenerative and distributive economy as the direction we need to try to find. And it's good to talk about it. Finding out how to get there is, of course, the big problem. Looking at the outer boundaries, science has demonstrated that we're already well into the danger zone for climate change and land system change. And we've gone far beyond what is sustainable with respect to genetic biodiversity loss, and nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. And other areas we don't really know how close we are to the boundaries, but we're clearly getting close to many of them today. Climate change, of course, is perhaps the most pressing immediate problem, in the sense that scientists are now saying we only have 7 years to turn the corner because it's been accelerating much faster than even the worst predictions of the scientific community in the past. And we're certainly following along the red curve in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and temperature rise. as we face up the reality of this problem and its impacts already happening around the world. When we look sort of behind it, what's driving it? Because that's where uncertainty comes from. The accepted limit for global warming without significant damage is probably 1.5 degrees. And I just had to change my slide yesterday because I had 1.2 degrees. 1.1 degrees. We've already reached 1.2 degrees very recently. But in Switzerland, it's already 2 degrees of warming because mountain areas like the polar regions are warming faster than other parts of the world. And the scientists can calculate how much more capacity there is in the atmosphere to absorb CO2 before we go beyond this temperature limit. And it's around 420, 580 gigatons of carbon. At least that's the ballpark figure. And we'll probably reach that by 2030. Just last year, we released more than 43 gigatons of carbon, 3.1% more over the year before. And even though with the pandemic, there's been a little bump earlier this year, I'm saying we've actually made no real difference at the speed at which carbon is rising in the atmosphere. It hasn't made a significant impact on this continuing rise. To put this in perspective, how much carbon is there in the oil, coal, and gas reserves that are already being exploited? This is the wells that are pumping, the mines that are being mined, the gas reserves. This is not counting fracking in America or Athabasca tar sands and so on. It's 2,795 gigatons of carbon compared to the regulated capacity, which is maybe 500 gigatons. So if we want to avoid catastrophic climate change, we have to leave 80% of the proven reserves off asset accounts and in the ground. Now tell that to Saudi Arabia and Russia and Shell and Total and so on. Shut down your economies. End your business. The challenges we're facing to respect what science is saying are really quite phenomenal. And this is not something that's been sort of surprised on us. Between 1880 and 2010, the 90 biggest industrial carbon producers produced half the rise in global temperature and a third of sea level rise. And we already know now that by 1965, the climate impact of fossil fuels was known, both by industry leaders and politicians. They found notes in the White House under Lyndon Johnson acknowledging the risk from fossil fuels. So this is something that people have consciously known about since 1965. And since then, the top 20 petroleum companies have created 35% of all integrated CO2 and methane emissions and plan to increase their production to 2030 before the pandemic hit. I saw some figures earlier, where I think one company was planning a 30% increase in production, and even Saudi Arabia 3 or 4% from the high point they're already at, and Russia and so on. Everybody was planning to keep on producing, knowing very well the impact that it was having. And in fact, they've delayed national and global action for decades and spent $200 million every year lobbying to delay, control, or block policies that tackle climate change. So we have this existential threat to all of humanity, and yet we have this sector of our economy defending its own profits and interest and ignoring the impact on the future of civilization. The result, of course, we have this enormous emissions gap, where incremental changes now won't be enough. We need rapid and transformational action. And the G20 members by themselves account for 78% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So the gap is large. If by 2030, if we want to meet the 2-degree goal, we need to remove 15 gigatons of carbon from what already has been promised in the nationally determined contributions under the Climate Change Convention. But that's for 2 degrees. If we want to go to 1.5 degrees goal, we need to remove 32 gigatons of carbon. So this is an enormous by 2030. That's in 10 years. So we need to strengthen these promises that countries have made under the Climate Change Convention. We have to strengthen them threefold if we want to respect 2 degrees, and fivefold to achieve 1.5 degrees. Clearly, this is not happening. Very few countries have actually pledged to make increases of what they already promised. Many, they still have the rest of this month to complete their promises, but we're far from getting the promises needed. And of course, even what they promised has often not been respected. So there's an enormous gap between what we said we would do, what we know is needed, and what's actually happening. Of course, the results of all of this, we have sea level rise estimated at 1.2 to 2 meters by 2100 and continuing several meters beyond that, could replace 600 million people by 2100. So many urban areas are vulnerable coastal areas, many ports areas and so on. And of course, with rapid polar warming, there are tipping points that could make melting irreversible. I saw a study recently saying that in Greenland, it may well be that already melting has reached the point where we can no longer stop it. And if Greenland continues to melt, that's 6 meters of sea level rise. So imagine what that would do. 1 meter of sea level rise is already goodbye to half of Florida, for example. So, this is really significant consequences coming in the near future because of our ignoring the reality of the scientific situation. The other problems, that's just climate change. We're looking at an extinction rate for biodiversity 1,000 times the pre-industrial level. With 2 degrees of global warming, we will lose 1/5 of all the places on the planet. We go to 4 degrees, we lose half the species on the planet. The cost of forest loss already is $2 to $5 trillion every year. Recent study in Germany showed that they'd lost 80% of all the insect biomass. It used to be we would drive because things splattered on our windscreen or windshield. It doesn't happen anymore. The insects are gone. Global animal biomass, wild animals, has been reduced by 82%. And now animal biomass is only a tiny fraction of the total animal biomass of the world, which is mostly people and the animals we raise, for food, cows and sheep and so on and so forth. So we've already destroyed much of nature. This is an example of a coral reef in Hawaii a few years ago, totally overgrown with seaweeds and totally destroyed. Another one, destroyed by dynamite blasting. These are the terrible things that are happening and increasing all around the world as we ignore what we're doing to nature. And of course, this is also, people talk a lot about the human population. And yes, human population has tripled in my own lifetime since I was born. And it's projected to rise to over 9 billion in 2050 and maybe 11 billion in 2100. Although others are now saying with the rapid decline in reproductive rates in wealthy countries and in cities, we could actually move to an aging population with many older people and fewer young people to maintain them later in the century. We're not quite certain what's going to happen to this curve in the years ahead. But of course, it's not that we need to kill off a part of the world population. The population problem is a result of an economy that increased wealth without addressing poverty. It's the poor people who are reproducing so rapidly because they have no alternative. So it's a classical pattern of overshoot and collapse. We've known it with flower beetles. They just grow and grow and grow to eat up all their food and then they die off. But of course, the carrying capacity of the planet for people depends both on numbers and our standard of living. If we want to have room for more people, we have to consume less. If we want to live like the Americans, we've got to do something about our numbers. Science, of course, would find ways to increase carrying capacity, but only at longer timescales, not within the timescale that we're facing the decades immediately ahead. And of course, the result, we have refugees, economic migrants, environmental displacement, enormous problems that are coming with hundreds of millions of people being moved around the world. Of course, this is related also to food production. The Green Revolution in the 1970s postponed food supply as a limit to growth. For a few decades, the Malthusian impact didn't actually happen. And one of my professors, Paul Ehrlich, who wrote about the population bomb, was proven wrong because he didn't anticipate what we would change in food production. But what we've done to produce that food is intensive agriculture with high energy, fertilizer, and petrochemical inputs. And it's driven by multinational agro-industries that capture all the profit for themselves and leave nothing for the poor farmers or the food producers. It's a total industrial system that has taken over and captured the entire system around the world today, patenting the seeds, forcing chemical inputs on people, changing legislation to protect their interests. It's all part of a system that, and I just heard a couple of days ago a webinar with the Food and Agriculture Organization where one of their directors was saying, we have 60 harvests left. Basically, at the way we're destroying the agricultural system, we're already peaked in the 1980s. We can't, we need to produce more food for the people who are coming, but we're not going to have enough water, phosphate, and energy. And they predict a total collapse in the agricultural system within 60 years if we don't get away from industrial, intensive agriculture, destroying the soil and destroying the water and everything else around the planet. This is an example of soil degradation. It's already an area more than India and China combined around the world. We've destroyed 65% of all soil from desertification or salinization or erosion. 300 million hectares can no longer produce food. 10 million hectares or more lost every year. So we're well past peak soil. So this is another shadow on the horizon that we need to act on very quickly. Of course, it's related to water shortages. Most water is now used for agriculture. We have to double water use by 2050 if we want to have the number of hungry. But already in 5 years, we expect 1.5 billion people living in regions of absolute water scarcity, 2/3 of the world population subject to water stress as climate change reduces rainfall in these areas. So this is another, the clump set of problems that we're facing around the world. Not to mention pollution between chemicals and plastics and so on, affecting biological processes, upsetting our immune system, causing cancers and diseases. There are a whole set of other problems I'm not even touching on this evening, that are all part of the sustainability challenge. And that's only on the environmental side. Look at the economic side. Just one example. We've been living a credit orgy of the last 50 years, especially since 2008. To keep growth going, we've been borrowing more and more. Levels of debt were already out of control before the pandemic, and now governments have ignored all the debt limits, and they're doing everything to try to save their societies by borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. And consumers are saturated with debt. Companies are saturated with debt. We've seen quantitative easing by central banks purchasing government debt to remove the short-term pressure, but creating a $300 trillion saturation of financial claims around the world. The US government has been growing its debt at twice its economic growth over the last 40 years, so that by 2022, the interest on the national debt in America will pass defense spending as the largest element in the federal budget. So we have this growth in GDP as a debt-fueled mirage, with industrial production peaking, leading ultimately a perfect storm of what do we do with debt we can never pay back again. So we have to think about how do we find smaller, simpler, more local, regional economies to try to replace the challenge that we're facing on the economic side as well. We could look at this in terms of the ecological footprint, how much land we need to meet our needs and to support and to absorb our wastes, whether it's an individual, a community, or a country. The global average today is 2.3 global hectares per person. That's what it takes to produce your food, absorb your waste, manage your carbon, and so on. In America, it's over 8 global hectares per person. China, 3.6, France, 4.4, Switzerland, 4.6. But the resources available, only 1.9 global hectares per person. So we overshot the Earth's capacity in 1970. And since then, we've been, living since August, perhaps, on, living on the capital of the planet and not its interest, as we run down the capacity of the planet to produce what we need. Of course, it's been predicted for more than 4 decades. Back in 1972, the Limits to Growth report to the Club of Rome used computer models to predict what would happen to civilization, going from say 1900 to 2000, 2100. That's these graphs. And so we can see on the left-hand side, they see population growing, resources being consumed, industrial output doing quite well, and life expectancy rising, consumer goods until about 2020, 2030. And then we hit planetary limits and civilization collapses. Of course, no economists liked that idea at the time, so they rubbish this report as this is all nonsense, nothing's going to happen, growth can keep going, technology will solve all of our problems. The scientists went back and repeated the study again for the Rio Summit in 1992. And they then showed that, in fact, if we began to move to sustainability at that time, 1995, we could, in fact, stabilize the world, bring down pollution, get equally manage consumer goods per person, and do quite well in a more sustainable society. But they warned even then, if we waited until 2015, we would have destroyed so much of the planet we couldn't avoid a major crisis in mid-century, and the standard of living we could have coming out of that was much lower than if we had made the change earlier and saved more of the Earth's capacity to produce what we need. Now, these were just scenarios, computer models. So scientists went back to the models and said, have we actually tracked relative to what was predicted? How well do they predict the future? back in 1972. And in fact, what they showed was we're following right on schedule. We've done slightly better on births and deaths, but everything else is following the curves exactly as predicted. Nothing says that the model is wrong. The limits are there. And the only thing that has changed is that any possibility of stabilizing and achieving sustainability without some kind of a crisis or catastrophe is no longer a realistic possibility. So that's what science is telling us. So, just to report, this is the 6th of February of this year, where scientists reported we're facing multiple eco-crises that could trigger systemic collapse, with risks of climate change, extreme weather events from hurricanes to heat waves, the decline of life-sustaining ecosystems, problems of food security, depleting sources of fresh water. They have a potential to impact and amplify one another in ways that might cascade to create global systemic collapse. That was just before the pandemic hit. So add the pandemic on top of all of that, and you can see how fragile we are at the moment and where we're going with our society. So is this the promised apocalypse? The four horsemen of the apocalypse? Pandemics, death, war, famine, the things that were predicted long ago. We're already seeing the pandemic and the deaths. We're facing the climate catastrophe, the biodiversity crisis, the coming financial crisis with overwhelming debt, famines on the horizon. Only thing missing is war for the moment. And given our leaders that even that is still a reasonable possibility, unfortunately. The pandemic, of course, slammed the brakes on the economy with massive unemployment, brought consumer society to a halt, at least in the short term. And in fact, many people found we could live without all those necessities sold to us by the consumer economy. And social dimension has taken on a new importance, with solidarity appearing everywhere. We were applauding the nurses, and so on and so on. So this is really our chance, our opportunity for fundamental transformation in the system if we want to take it. And of course, when you look at it from a systems perspective, yes, we're facing institutional inertia, the multinational corporations that certainly don't want to change, vested interests blocking change on many fronts. But maybe they're like the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were dominating their epoch. They were the most powerful things everywhere. But the environment changed, an asteroid hit, and they were wiped out. And we see our global environment changing as well today, globalizing in a way that it never has before. So perhaps the old system must collapse to make way for a new one to take its place. But clearly, given this is going to be a global collapse, we need governance at the scale of the problem, which is why we come to the challenges of governance as the major issue to talk about this evening. So how do we find governance for sustainability? How can we finally manage necessary transition to sustainability while embodying principles of federalism and the oneness of humanity, the principles the Baha'i faith talks about so much? So now first look briefly at some of the parts of the problem. We're living in a paradigm of national sovereignty, the nation state, where of course war is the final recourse if you want to impose your state's will on some others. And we've avoided that for a while, but it's still very much on the horizon. And of course, it's also a system with international anarchy. There's no rule of law at the global level. Countries can do what they want. You know, uh, and of course, they're still struggling for power and world domination, particularly the major powers. They're still playing the old game. And in fact, we see a pushback today against multilateralism and cooperation. And at the same time, of course, warfare is increasingly dangerous to survival of the human race. And we see all the investment in new weapons, technological systems, drones, and automatic, killing devices, and so on. Cyber warfare. This is still very much on the horizon. People are afraid of war. They want for peace, but they can't do anything about it because the world seems to be filled with ego and corruption and aggression and the rise of reckless political leaders and the retreat of democracy in many places. So, the problems that we face with the governments are really, quite substantial today. And so we've been warned about this in the Baha'i writings and the Baha'i teachings. The International Governing Body of the Baha'i Faith, Universal House of Justice, has addressed these problems of achieving world peace through global governance. And it noted in a message a couple of years ago that after the First World War and the Paris Peace Conference, the Guardian of the Baha'i Faith, was leader at that time, could discern the progress, however fitful, of the forces working in harmony with the spirit of the age. these forces have continued to move humanity towards an age of peace. Not merely a peace which rules out armed conflict, but a collective state of being manifesting unity. Well, that's a beautiful definition of what peace really is. It's not just the absence of war, but a collective state of being manifesting unity at the planetary level. And they then said, well, this is a long journey in fits and starts, with 3 historical moments reaching for real lasting peace, but always falling short. The first, of course, being the Paris Conference and the establishment of the League of Nations. We still have the Palais des Nations in Geneva as the remnant, so to speak, the League of Nations of the 1930s, and the conference hall where they hoped to be able to decide and agree on peace. Then, of course, we had, after World War II, the United Nations Organization, formed from the ashes of the League, with the system of international economic institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, and advances in human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights, and international. So major progress was made forward with the UN and has still been around 75 years later. So we have the UN in New York. Then, of course, at the Cold War, there were explicit for the establishment of a new global order. And then again, it seemed at around 2000 that world peace might be within grasp. And in fact, we saw this the rise in global consciousness, that these various advances, despite the many limitations, their imperfections, and the horrifying conflicts that continue to unfold during this time, stand nonetheless as signs of a widespread, gradual, but inexorable rise in global consciousness on the part of Earth's peoples, and their attraction to universal justice, to solidarity, to collaboration, to compassion, and to equality. All part of our vision of a better civilization to come. But they also warned us the new challenges that are rising in this century since the turn of the century, retreating from the promised steps forward. Many of the dominant currents in societies everywhere are pushing people apart, not drawing them together. These currents include exorbitant wealth, intransigence in thinking, religious fundamentalism, a decline in public trust, vested interests seeking to undermine the credibility of all sources of knowledge, including science and reality and even truth, and resurgent forces of racism, nationalism, and factionalism. A pretty frightening set of forces that we have to fight against with the world as it is at the present time. And so they said, thus do the forces of disintegration regroup and gain ground. So be it. The unification of humanity is unstoppable by any human force. That's a wonderful promise of what's going to come. There is no reason to doubt that the world's current state of disorder and confusion will worsen, as we see it is, possibly with catastrophic consequences, until a chastened humanity sees fit to take another significant step, perhaps this time decisive, towards enduring peace. So worries for the immediate future and a promise for what can still come. And in fact, in September, the Bahá'í International Community issued this beautiful statement, the anniversary of the United Nations, entitled, "A Governance Befitting Humanity and the Path Towards a Just Global Order." And these are a few quotes from it to show how they define that path ahead and what we need to be doing to try to follow that path towards a better world order and global governance. And they first point out the rapidly shifting global realities that prompt a deeper appreciation of humanity's interconnection and interdependence. Amidst the disruption created and accelerated by world-engulfing pandemic, numerous possibilities are opening for marked social change that can bring stability to the world and enrich the lives of its inhabitants. Throughout history, periods of turbulence have presented opportunities to redefine collective values and the assumptions that underlie them. So again, the reality of the pandemic, but maybe it will open possibilities for the future. And a growing chorus of voices is calling for decisive steps forward in our collective trajectory towards enduring universal peace. The human family is one. Its profound implications for collective behavior must now give rise to a coordinated movement towards higher levels of social and political unity. As Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, declared over a century ago, true peace and tranquility will only be realized when every soul will have become the well-wisher of all mankind. And they warn us the perils of a global community divided against itself are too great to countenance. So recent events have demonstrated that current arrangements are no longer sufficient in the face of cascading and increasingly interconnected threats that we've seen before. Integration and coordination must therefore be extended further. The only viable way forward lies in a system of deepening global cooperation. In recent years, a reasoned critique of multilateral arrangements has, at times, been eclipsed by rejection of the very idea of a rules-based international order. We've seen a number of countries claiming this today. Yet this period of pushback is embedded in a broader historical processes, carrying the global community towards stronger unity. At each stage in human history, more complex levels of integration become not only possible, but necessary. This is basic system science. New and more pressing challenges emerge, and the body politic is compelled to devise new arrangements that address the needs of the time through greater inclusivity, coherence, and collaboration. I think beautiful words we need to think about more and more. Inclusivity, coherence, and collaboration. So how do we do this? We therefore find ourselves at the threshold of a defining task, purposefully organizing our affairs in full consciousness of ourselves as one people in one shared homeland. And we got the first step to that. This is the Stockholm Conference, 1972, one of the first steps towards addressing environmental problems at the global level, where I was present. But what is needed today is a settled consensus that, while preserving the various systems and cultures around the world, embodies a set of common values and principles that can attract the support of every nation. Bring this down to the level of values and principles where we can, in fact, unite. And there's a measure of agreement around these shared principles and norms, such as the universality of human rights, the imperative to eradicate poverty, or the need to live within environmentally sustainable limits. This is our global environmental governance. And they point out that a framework that accommodates a diversity of approaches, built on a commitment to unity and a shared ethic of justice, would allow common principles to be put into practice in countless arrangements and formulations. Within such a framework, differences in political structure, legal system, and social organization would stand not as points of friction, but as sources of potential insight into new solutions and approaches, a learning community in a sense. So the true acknowledgement of global interdependence requires genuine concern for all, for the welfare of any segment of humanity is inextricably bound up with the welfare of the whole. We're all in this together today. So whatever benefits have accrued from past conceptions of state sovereignty, present conditions demand a far more holistic and coherent approach to analysis and decision-making. For example, what will be the global implications of domestic policies? What choices contribute to shared prosperity and sustainable peace? What steps foster nobility and preserve human dignity? Imagine if all of our governments asked those questions before taking any domestic policy decision. This is what helped to bring us all together. And so this awareness of the oneness of humanity is increasingly woven into the process of decision-making, will make nations easier to see each other as genuine partners in the stewardship of the planet and securing the prosperity of its peoples. And the progress for all is not attainable if material advancement is divorced from spiritual and ethical advancement. We need to bring in the values dimension to move together with what we can do, at a practical or political level. Economic growth over recent decades has indisputably brought prosperity for many. But with that growth, unmoored from justice and equity, A few have disproportionately benefited from its fruits, and many are in precarious conditions. That's the half of humanity that's not benefited from the present economy. Those living in poverty are at the greatest risk from any contraction of the world economy, as is happening today, which exacerbates existing inequalities and intensifies suffering. This is an enormous challenge of justice, what we're going through at the moment. Just think about all the poor parts of the world, rural India and so on, and the impacts it's having now, when suddenly they've lost their jobs in the city and so on and so forth. It's an enormous challenge for them as much as anybody. And every effort to advance society, even if concerned with material conditions alone, rests on underlying moral assumptions. Only by ensuring that material progress is consciously connected to spiritual and social progress can the promise of a better world be fulfilled. We've of course been told this from the Baha'i World Center, this is the guidance we keep getting, what we have to address. The movement towards more coordinated and genuinely cooperative international relations will eventually require a process in which world leaders come together to recast and reconstitute the global order. For once, what was once reviewed as an idealistic vision of international cooperation has, in the light of the obvious and serious challenges facing humanity, become a pragmatic necessity. This is really the call. We've got to come together and rebuild the system. And that's what we need to be looking at. We'll look at this evening. How can we go forward with some of those ideas? And objectives incompatible with the pursuit of the common good will need to be set aside. Until this is the dominant ethic, lasting progress will prove elusive. They propose, for example, in reforming the United Nations, a World Council on Future Affairs could institutionalize consideration of how policies might impact generations to come and give attention to a range of issues, such as preparedness for global crises like the one we're going through now, the use of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, or the future of education or employment. Strengthening the legal framework relating to the natural world, so actually laws that we could apply globally, say for climate change, would lend coherence and vigor to the biodiversity, climate, and environmental regimes, and provide a robust foundation for a system of common stewardship of the planet's resources. That's one of the key objectives of improving governance for sustainability at the global level. So progress toward the goals enshrined in global agendas, like the same development goals, calls for a conscious orientation towards experimentation, search, innovation, and creativity. We don't have all the answers, but we can work together to try to find them. Respect for international law, upholding fundamental human rights, adherence to treaties and agreements. Only to the extent that such commitments are honored in practice can the United Nations and its member states demonstrate a standard of integrity and trustworthiness before the people of the world. We've seen today how easy it is for governments to ignore their agreements, go back on what they promised, withdraw from agreements, and so on. There's no trustworthiness, and so they must learn to build some trust if we want to go forward. Barring this, no amount of administrative reorganization will resolve the host of long-standing challenges before us. As Baha'u'llah declared, words must be supported by deeds, for deeds are the true test of words. And that's Baha'u'llah's shrine in the Holy Land from which this wisdom originally came. So collaboration is possible on scales undreamt of in past ages. This is the technology revolution, opening unparalleled prospects for progress. Yet failure to reach an arrangement supporting effective global coordination risks consequences far more severe, potentially catastrophic, than those arising from recent disruptions like the ones we seem to be going through now. And so, but they quote Baha'u'llah, let them take counsel together, and through anxious and full deliberation, administer to a diseased and sorely afflicted world the remedy it requireth. This is the call to leaders to take counsel together and address these problems. So what can we do about all this? It's nice to say this is what we need to do. The universal house of justice has helped us to see what we can do to contribute to a path to a just, sustainable global order. Just a few examples of what they've done. This is the seat of the World Human Rights Justice on the Mount Carmel in Haifa, Arizona, from which this wisdom comes. And they said in last March, seldom has it been more evident that society's collective strength is dependent on the unity it can manifest in action. From the international stage to the grassroots, we've got to build unity, look at our communities, in governments, and at the international level. And the world stands more and more in need of the hope and strength that that faith imparts. So that unity has to come from something that's spiritual. It's not going to come just from the material side of life. I've actually written a book recently to explore what hope means with respect to the challenges that we're facing. And they say, however difficult matters are at present, however close to the limits of their endurance some sections of human societies are brought, humanity will ultimately pass through this ordeal, and it will emerge on the other side with greater insight and a deeper appreciation of its inherent oneness and interdependence. So we're going through trials and difficulties, but they will help us to grow out of this and give us the strength to make the steps we need to go forward. And they point out that leaders, prominent thinkers, and commentators have begun to explore fundamental concepts and bold aspirations that, in recent times, have been largely absent from public discourse. I've just been taking part in the last 2 days of exactly this kind of thing going on. At present, these are but early glimmerings, yet they hold out the possibility that a moment of collective consciousness may be in view. So, world unity is finally possible. A global order that unifies the nations with the asset of humanity is the only adequate answer to the destabilizing forces that threaten the world. However, though world unity is possible, nay, inevitable, it ultimately cannot be achieved with the unreserved acceptance of the oneness of humankind. And therefore, fostering unity, for harmonizing disparate elements, nurturing in every heart a selfless love for humankind, is the task of religion. Too often we don't turn to religion as a solution, and yet here they're telling us clearly this is the responsibility to create that selfless love of humankind, which only a spiritual impetus can do. So no matter how bleak conditions may appear at any given time, no matter how dismal the immediate prospects are for bringing about unity, there is no cause for despair. The distressing state of the world can only spur us to redouble our commitment to constructive action. They quote Baha'u'llah, these are not days of prosperity and triumph. The whole of mankind is in the grip of manifold ills. Strive, therefore, to save its life through the wholesome medicine which the almighty hand of the unerring physician hath prepared. Consider Baha'u'llah's words, they quote again. Address yourselves to the promotion of the well-being and tranquility of the children of men. Bend your minds and wills to the education of the peoples and kindreds of the earth, that haply the dissensions that divide it may, through the power of the most great name, be blotted out from its face, and all mankind become the upholders of one order and the inhabitants of one city. So, sensitized as we are to the importance of harmony and the fruitlessness of conflict, we, the followers of Baha'u'llah, seek to cultivate those conditions that are most conducive to the emergence of unity in any setting. And the House even says, we are heartened to see the believers expanding their efforts to participate in the discourses of society, especially those friends who, in their professional capacity, are able to contribute discourses directly related to peace. And this is why, with 2 other friends of mine working in this area, of peace and governance, we decided to bring together our ideas on global governance and the emergence of global institutions for the 21st century. And in fact, last year we won a prize from the Global Talents Foundation, for our ideas on global governance, which led us to produce very rapidly our book, The Global Governance for the 21st Century. We tried to bring together our experience. Augusto is an international economist with many years of experience in international institutions. Maya is an international lawyer. I'm an environmentalist. And together we say, what do we have to fix in the UN system in order to, find the kind of governance we need for sustainability in the 21st century. So we first, of course, look at the flaws in the UN Charter. There were the political compromises that gave the victors of World War II a veto power in the Security Council, with permanent members being, you might say, above the law. They can veto anything they don't like. And they've refused to give the Council independent means to enforce its decisions. And while the Charter provides for its review and revision, they've always blocked any review and of the Charter. So we've got these built-in flaws that have prevented us from really making use of what the UN Charter set out to do. And in fact, as I pointed out, it's entirely voluntary. Conventions are only binding on the states that sign them and ratify them, and they can withdraw if they want. So voluntary law is not sufficient to address the problems of the world today. And so our approach is to say what we need for effective governance is both legislative, executive, judicial functions that work at the global level, as we accept they always work at the national level. But nations only give up their right to make war in exchange for effective mechanisms of collective security and peaceful settlement of disputes. They've got to have something better. So we need the gradual development of relevant international institutions and processes to build confidence in their effectiveness in reducing national insecurity with carefully coordinated disarmament, with some trust that justice will be done. But of course, as I pointed out, states also have to become trustworthy with a collective sense of moral responsibility. Have to work both up from the local level with the values and the global level in terms of changing the systems. And of course, we have to address the fear of global governance. Many people say, well, if national government is bad, the government will be much worse. Suppose Hitler took over the world, what would we do? So we have to reassure them. We can have stronger democratic control. We can increase representativeness and accountability in decision making. We need a bill of individual human rights at the global level, and the declaration of national rights and responsibilities, with checks and balances and judicial control, and clear ethical foundations for governance. So these are ways we can say, well, we can make governance work at the global level. We also have to say, limit the scope of national governance. We only need to govern certain kinds of things. Clearly, peace and security and dispute settlement have to be done globally. Human rights are a global issue. Protecting the global environment and areas beyond national jurisdiction, the atmosphere, the high seas, that's clearly something that only governments could do globally. We need principles of subsidiarity and unity and diversity. Many things should be taken down to the national and the local level. The global system shouldn't try to do everything. And that would also be a guarantee for the future. So there are elements of charter revision. We can activate those elements. We can replace the national sovereignty by national autonomy, because sovereignty doesn't really exist anymore in a globalized world with a global economy, and show the primacy of the global common interest in peace and sustainability. So we'll say, looking at the legislative dimension, the General Assembly, we have to make it representing people as well as governments, with weighted membership by population, by the economy, and by being a state, ensuring balanced representation of regions, states of different sizes, and a variety of cultures and peoples, empowered to adopt legislation in the global interest, binding on all countries in its areas of jurisdiction. We also need to support the legislation with advisory mechanisms, a temporary civil society, so that civil society people have a direct voice in the legislative process, scientific advice for climate change and things where science is needed, Office of Technology Assessment for all those things like whether it be geoengineering, artificial intelligence, new technologies, how do we assure the good side and protect the bad side? Office of Ethical Assessment to make sure that the values are always considered when considering what laws are needed and how they should be applied. We would replace the Security Council by a broader Executive Council, eliminating the veto and the consensus rule with broader management functions, developing the executive functions of the UN and the program, making it much more coherent as a UN system, with a membership between permanent and collective seats, Chairman Secretary General, so that everybody has a voice in how this all works. We need enforcement mechanisms, a standing international peace force under UN control, plus a reverse force that's bigger than any one country's army, with a disarmament commission and phase disarmament so we can gradually pull away from the militarized world that we have today, and a mediation and conciliation commission to solve disputes in other ways. We, of course, need to make the rule of law binding at the global level. The International Court of Justice exists, but it's only voluntary. It can only make judgments if governments agree to its jurisdiction. We have to give it binding jurisdiction over all states and the right to interpret international legal texts. We need an international human rights tribunal, international anti-corruption court, where governments can only control corruption when the government itself is corrupt, and an attorney general and other structures at the global level. We need to improve the funding of the UN. We imagine, for instance, an automatic contribution of 0% of GDP from each member country. That would raise $70 billion, twice total UN funding, 5 times the regular budget already. Then we can imagine other things like a Tobin tax or the revenue collection mechanisms, and of course, eliminating opportunities for the wealthy and private enterprises to escape from taxation, as they do so much in the world today, where they simply got to go beyond any one country. We need specialized agencies for global risks. We need to consolidate some of the specialized that we have now, make them more coherent. As like Sarah, it's a very fragmented system. Reform the IMF to protect from financial collapse. We need new organizations to address inequality in the world, to regulate businesses at the global level, to harmonize tax regimes. We need to address climate change with binding limits on greenhouse gas emissions. We need to manage the biodiversity, the environment, risk management at the global level. And we need to address migration with the reformed International Organization for Migration. So a lot can be done to strengthen the various executive functions to deal with issues at the global level. We need supporting measures, education for representatives taking part in these processes, for the civil servants, the international civil service, for the members of the peace force. We need wide public education to prepare democratic elections around the world, because ultimately we'd like to see a General Assembly elected by all the peoples of the world. And we need to educate the principles and values based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the values we already have in the conventions. A lot is there. People need to understand them, believe in them, and work to apply them. And of course, ultimately, we need to strengthen trust and trustworthiness. States must trust that decisions are really taken in the common interest. People must trust that their human rights will be protected. Everybody should be able to develop their full potential to contribute to society. And governments must be trustworthy, with everything founded on justice for all, where sacrifices that need to be made are shared equitably, and that nobody is left behind. Those are really the values behind global governments in a sustainable world. So how do we get there? We've explored some of these in our proposals. We could consider an active consultative will, in a conference of all states, leaders deciding, now let's solve the problems, get together. We could sort of, where there is a crisis, try to leverage some progress. Or we could wait for catastrophe to force the transformation. And that may be what happens. That's the fallback position. If we don't act sooner in a consultative way, clearly catastrophe is going to force us finally to make the transition. We could start with a World Parliamentary Assembly. It doesn't require a change in the UN Charter. General Assembly could itself create such a mechanism with all the people in the world choosing representatives to advise the General Assembly on legislation. We could do like the European Union did. They started with a coal and steel community after the war, cooperating in one small area to build trust and gradually expanding to do more and more things together. So in the same way, we can start with climate change. Say, let's act on climate change. And once we've seen that that works, we could then build global governance structures to other areas globally, afterwards. And of course, if the great majority of nations want to move forward to reform the Charter, and only a few holdouts, probably the permanent members with a veto, block it, the second option is to have a Charter replacement conference and say, we're going to create a new organization to abandon the old one, like the UN did with the League of Nations. We could transfer its assets to subsidiary bodies, and the holdouts could be left holding an empty structure until they decide to join. So there are various ways we could go forward that we could explore depending on what governments are ready to do. And of course, we need to build communities on spiritual principles. The House has told us the devoted efforts that we're making with our like-minded collaborators to build communities founded on spiritual principles, to apply those principles for the betterment of our societies, to offer the insights arising. These are the surest ways that we can hasten the fulfillment of the promise of world peace. And everybody can be doing that. So the pathway to sustainability will be one of empowerment, collaboration, and continual processes of questioning, learning, and action in all regions of the world. It will be shaped by the experiences of women, men, children, the rich, the poor, the governors, and the governed, as each one is enabled to play their rightful role in constructing a new society. As the sweeping tides of consumerism, unfettered consumption, extreme poverty, and marginalization recede, they will reveal the human capacities for justice, reciprocity, and happiness. And that's really the future that we should be working for, that we should be inspiring to build, regardless of the challenges that we're facing at the present time. I included in my presentation, which you can then consult afterwards, the references to some of the major sources I've been quoting in this presentation. Thank you very much for your patience and listening to me. I know it's been pretty dense, but I hope that it's been something that will be useful in thinking about how we can address governance at the global level. Let me stop sharing so we can open to discussion, questions, whatever you would like to raise.
Arthur, it seems you have written the handbook on how to recreate the UN. This is extremely exciting.
Well, Heather can have 50 pages into just less than an hour's presentation. But yes, we thought if we at least can make it look as reasonable, practical as possible, maybe we can take it seriously. As long as some sort of abstract ideal out there in the future, it's a utopia, we'll never reach it. But if we could actually take content, this is what we can do concretely here and there, take with that, fix that, and so on. Maybe we'll say that actually might work. Let's work for it. That was our attempt to try to take this and run with it and say, what can we do to stimulate the actions going forward?
All right, we are open for questions, comments, thoughts.
If you're not totally deadened by such an intensive thing. Most people, after I've talked, they just sort of, blown out of it. They can't sort it all out. There's too much at once to absorb. But
I love how you limited the scope of the, your suggested new UN version 2 to only specific global issues and not too much. So it's not too overwhelming for nations to feel like they're losing their sovereignty, right?
Exactly. Well, and we see in the House of Justice, I keep saying that there are diversity of approaches. There are different ways of doing things. In the statement for the anniversary, they highlight how it's important to let many different ways of finding solutions to problems. I quoted that in the meeting that I was speaking at yesterday and today, and so I said that was really they liked that because that was really very reassuring that we're not looking at some top-down imposed single way of doing things. We're looking at all the diversity and the richness of the human family and building on that to find many ways and inspiring each other to find better ways of going forward. It's a very complex systems approach to solving the problems of the world. In the same way that you do it in religion with progressive revelation, we're doing it in science with progressive environment. We're doing it in politics. And all. This is the kind of thinking that the Baha'i faith has brought to the world.
You mentioned that a lot of the population growth, if we're worried, some of us are worried about population growth in terms of just the carrying capacity of the earth. And that book you mentioned that was written a couple decades ago about the population boom and how it's not actually turning out to be true because a lot of the rich nations that use most of the resources per capita are having a declining birth rate to such an extent that their populations are leveling out. And I know that Japan and places like Italy
Yes.
have a really low, maybe the lowest in the world. Do you know of other industrialized first world nations that are?
I think Spain is also a number. This is people often think the problem is population. We've got to kill off most of the people of the world to get back to living the way we want to live correctly. And of course, they all want to exterminate somebody else. It's never but themselves, their own problem. It's all those dark races in the South that are multiplying out of hand and so on. It's a very racist view of looking at things. But I've always taken it separate in the sense that the reason that we have that rapid population growth is poverty. It's the poor people with no alternative. The women who've never been educated, who are never educated. It's the lack of education. It's the poverty that has maintained parts of the world in that situation. As we see in South Africa today, the poor that are still seeing the growth. But it's not that we lack enough wealth to give everybody education, everybody food, and so on. It's the economic system that has allowed that poverty to persist. And therefore, the population growth is a symptom of the problem. The underlying problem is the economic system the extremes of wealth and poverty. But I was just reading a report earlier today. There's a group of scientists who signed signed a declaration on addressing sustainability, and they're publishing also working papers. One of them is on the affluence, and they point out that if you look at climate change, if you look at the problems of the world, the largest contributor of everything is the affluent. It's the excessive consumption of the rich. The poor hardly contribute anything to climate change. And in fact, even with all the technological change we can imagine, all the green economies and everything, as long as it maintains affluence, it's not going to solve the problem. Because we're simply consuming so much more than everybody else, and so much more than the planet can produce. The only way we could move for sustainability is to go to much simpler lifestyles and get away from this consumer society. And everything is to driving it, so to keep buying more and changing more and consuming more and planned obsolescence and all the rest of it. So that's for those of us, probably most of us who are listening onto this, are part of that more as affluent group, and we just have to accept. And of course, if you cut down on affluence, you cut down on GDP. That means the economy can't keep growing in the material way that it has been. So, and then where that then says, well, that means enormous levels of unemployment. If we think this is bad, the pandemic is bad, this is nothing wrong what will be required to move for sustainability. So how do we cope with all of those changes? How do we plan them in the most just and equitable way for all those who are going to lose their jobs and so on as we go forward? This is an enormous set of challenges. And we have to say, how do we manage this? And how do we experiment with alternatives and finding our ways forward? Other questions or comments?
Yeah, I wanted to comment.
Yes. Yes.
I don't know if maybe other people saw this program earlier this week on BBC World News, which was essentially Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, making a plea to the world in favor of climate change and a sustainable future. It was, in some ways, he was being interviewed also and questioned by various environmental activists, young people from around the world, many sort of indigenous populations and so on. So it was, on the one hand, a very positive contribution, a very important call to the world. But at the same time, it emphasized to me some of the impotence of this huge organization of the United Nations, as you have outlined, Arthur, that the Secretary General needs to come and make this call to people, and they possess essentially no power to enforce and make any of these conventions binding on the member states. So I thought it was a very interesting illustration of many of the problems you've outlined.
I've worked with the UN system for decades. I follow it closely, and yes, it does lots of wonderful things. And in fact, when you put together the good things it's doing, the good things that many from our are doing, and so on, there are lots of steps of progress forward. Lots of people are motivated in the right direction, and so on. They're doing. The problem is that alongside those good things, you have all the destructive forces in the world, the multinational corporations where profit is the only thing that counts. I highlighted just a few examples of it. There are many more. And where there's no governance of the economy, they've always blocked any attempt to create a UN economic organization. When they created the World Trade Organization, they put it outside the UN so they could keep more control of it and so on. So that the system has blocked all the options for improvement to maintain the momentum and power of its destruction of the planet for short-term, selfish, egotistical aims built into the institutions of society today. And yet, it's easy to see how even you might think the most powerful person in the United Nations is actually powerless because he has no leverage on those parts of the system. Other questions or comments? Yes.
How would you see practically how such a unimaginable, at least for me, unimaginable radical transformation can happen? What could realistically be happen to to see this transformation?
Well, look at the example of the Soviet Union. It seemed like an enormous superpower monolith, and it collapsed very quickly from its internal contradictions. I'm not convinced that the capitalist system is any more stable. I think it has, and I think when you look at, I quoted several warnings about possibly catastrophic, coming catastrophe. We've not seen anything yet relative to what is coming. All of those seem to be warnings that there's something, something suddenly should cause the limbs of mankind to quake, as Baha'u'llah said at one point. And it could be a third world war, which would be terribly catastrophic. The better solution would be a financial collapse. If this system that's maintained itself so long by endless borrowing, by endless accumulation of debt, which is why I put some of those figures in, to the slides I was sharing with you. If all of that comes home to roost, and you suddenly recognize that you cannot keep borrowing forever and ever. Debt can't go on forever and ever and never be reimbursed. Something has to give. There were actually, I think there's something where the Garvey spoke to said that the point would come where the American dollar would be worthless, and that could happen if if they've that suddenly the financial system collapses and there's nothing behind it anymore. People realize that it's all an artificial conduction, a house of cards that can come collapsing down. Now, if something like that happened, it would shut down most of the corporate world. It would shut down that economic system, which is driven by borrowing and debt. All of the corporations have enormous levels of debt as well, or they've hidden all of their money in tax-free havens to avoid taxes, before it might evaporate as well overnight. So it seems to me that something must happen to the inertia of that system that would cause it to go over the edge. And then, of course, the question is, how do we live through the trauma of what that would imply and come out the other side? And of course, again, when we look at what we're told to do in the Baha'i community, build community, develop solidarity, work with your neighbors, work in your neighborhoods, at the local level, this is the foundation for the future. That's the best insurance. If there's a collapse at other levels in the civilization that we're going through, the civilization, the best insurance will be what you can do together to muddle through this and find solutions to the problems you're facing. So it says, my vision of my scenario of the future is that, yes, we're putting it before people what we need to do to change. We can't predict what will trigger what along the process. We're looking increasingly unstable, and therefore increasing the likelihood that some kind of break in the system needs to come. And the question is then, how do we work through that? How do we, enough of us survive, to start building out the other side? And then we can go back, well, this is what we should have done. Let's sit down, if we can, and as quickly as possible, rebuild the other elements of the structure we need to go advancing world civilization. I'm still hopeful. That's why I wrote a book on hope. Yeah, I'm still hopeful. Yes, go ahead, please.
I'm thinking a little bit smaller than,
yes,
but with the complex levels of integration, the framework, and the social organization, I just wondered to anybody how you would view the roles of young people, like between 15 and 25, when your moral sense is developing and is really sharp, and how for older people to guide the younger people to taking a role in all of this. Is that unclear?
Others are going to come in. I think certainly they're the generation who has to live through this and build the other side. And the more that we can do, and we see that with the Junior Youth Empowerment Program, if we can vaccinate them against materialism and get them to see that the real pleasure comes from helping other people, from doing something altruistic, from creating your own projects and finding solutions and so on. Those are the foundational values that would allow them not to be dragged down if things collapse. My job in the UN for a decade was managing the UN system-wide Earthwatch. which meant all the monitoring of the global environment, see what problems might come in the future with the space agencies, the research programs, and everything else. So it's really the systems view of the whole planet. One of the things people do often think about is if there were a giant solar flare. The last one that happened was in 1859. And it broke through the magnetosphere and created such an enormous electrical charge at the surface that all the telegraph operators got terrible shocks from the wires that they were touching on the telegraph. That was the only detector of what was happening. If something like that happened today, it would grill everything electrical and electronic on the planet. Now imagine if suddenly tomorrow you didn't have your digital bank account, you didn't have a cell phone, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have all the things that we depend on, in this system. It's much more fragile than we expect. There could be a cyber warfare that could cut us off from many parts of the world. So there's a fragility to these things that we should not become totally dependent on if we can help it. Use them while we have them. Be detached if something happens to them, and have other ways that we can build forward and build a better community that has to come out of all of this.
Thanks.
Other contributions? Don't let me get all the answers. Some of you, I'm sure, have answers as well. So feel free to contribute if you would like to.
I appreciate your conversation. And I work with a lot of Gen Zs, and I think they're already thinking this way. It's just inherent in their consciousness. But I appreciate your reference to donut economics. I've recently been introduced to it. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about, because a lot of people are afraid of this is what they know, this economic system. They don't think it can change any other way. So getting other ideas out there. And then the other thing that was going through my mind was the whole rights of nature and keeping these things in mind as we move forward. Do you have anything to say about the rights of nature?
Well, there are many elements in the Baha'i writings talk about the importance of nature, the rights of nature. There was, when Baha'u'llah was in prison, you've been there, what, 9 years in prison. One day he made the remark, and this is quoted in Bahá'í in the New Era, that the city was the world of the body, the countryside was the world of the soul. And he loved nature, and he missed nature. And there are many references to the importance of nature. The whole compilation on the IEF website about the value of nature, the beauty of nature, the diversity of nature. At Stanford University in 1912, Abdul Baha, the son of the founder of the Baha'i Faith, gave a talk to all the student body and the faculty on science and religion. And he said, and he talked a lot about ecological principles, the balance, everything connected in this global system of life that's been, that God has created. And he says, should man, infinite superior, be a destroyer of the balance in that system? So he actually warned us not to be a destroyer of the beauties, the wonder, the integration, the fantastic things that nature can provide to us. So yes, you could write a whole ecology textbook with quotations from the Baha'i writings if you wanted to. It's all that, which is why I became an ecologist. I grew up as a Baha'i, and that was natural to go on and and apply the values in the field of science. You even said, if you've ever looked at pictures of the Baha'i World Center or even visited there, you have these beautiful formal gardens riding up Mount Carmel, blending into nature along the sides. It's even there's an integration, the formal beauty that man creates connected with the natural beauty of the natural world. So the symbolism is everywhere.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you very much for the very comprehensive presentation about all the challenges humanity is facing and some suggestions for a world governance. I was wondering, with the book you wrote together with the two friends, did you get any feedback from the United Nations or maybe for some senior people there?
Yes, the The Baha'i community had a presentation in New York for top people of the UN. We've had a whole series of discussions with the Undersecretary General, for UN reform and other key people there. And in fact, the top advisor to the UN on UN reform was another winner of the New Shape Prize, that we won, last year, and knows us very well. We're collaborating closely with the foundation that gave the prize, which is trying to support, move towards global governance in general, is funding our further work. He was in close consultation with the top officials in the United Nations, is invited to contribute to the Secretary General's paper on the reform of the UN that is to be produced, in this next year, and so on. So we're integrated very closely into the whole process of rethinking these things for us at the UN and outside of it. Of course, we plan to do much more. We're going to travel around the world, talking in Beijing and Johannesburg and everywhere. Of course, the pandemic shut that down, so we've had to go online. But we're doing everything we can to get the idea forward, and they're well received. There's strong interest with people. This is really, defines what we need to be doing, and we're building partnerships to carry this forward to try to make a difference in the world. It's amazing when you come with some Baha'i principles and ideas, it can open all sorts of doors. People say, that sounds right, and they want to carry it forward. Other questions or comments? You can also post them on the chat if you would like to. I don't see any yet, but
earlier you started to say something about what gives you hope. So I would be very curious now at this stage in the history of mankind, what gives you hope?
Well, I would say, in the long term, we have the promises in the Baha'i faith of an ever-rising world civilization. And I quoted several times, we're told there's difficulty, but we will come out of that process. The short term may not look so good, but people will learn the lessons and they will grow out of this process, and then we will go forward. So that gives me hope. I think the only thing that sort of worries me now is that I'm now 78. And I think, will I live long enough to begin to see us coming out the other side? We're just about to start, 10 years of plans for the Baha'is. That would take me to the age of 90. I don't know about my individual hope. It would be nice to be able to hope that I would see everybody buying into this and carrying it forward. If not, I have to pass on that hope to other generations, which I wrote a book on the subject, because one does what we can with what one can with the resources that one has. I think I've been extremely lucky in all that I've been able to do in my life, trying to be of service, that in general things have succeeded more or less. It's never been perfect, but that we've been able to make steps forward in building regional cooperation, in buying into the environmental issues and young people taking them forward and so on. People that heard me talking years ago and became environmentalists and are now senior professors, working on these issues and so on and so forth. Yes, there's lots of reasons to be hopeful. Should we end on a word of hope, or do you want to go further? The moderation in all things, including webinars. So I leave it to all of you to decide when you feel that we've taken this far enough for one evening. As I say, I've tried to share the content here. That was only a short selection. If you're really desperate to go into it, there's a 550-page book that you can read to go into the details. But already the Baha'i community statement and the guidance we've been receiving recently can all help us to find our way forward and to find what we can do ourselves. And a lot of it, what we can do ourselves. We don't have to wait for everybody else to solve these problems elsewhere. We know we can start building at the local level. We can start with our neighbors and our friends and our family, and we can begin to lay a foundation for those values that will allow us to build peace, to allow us to be more sustainable. We can question our lifestyles. Maybe the things I can do to already live, being content with little and free from all inordinate desire, and meeting my needs, not succeed at them. There's always things. We're often trapped in a system. We don't have many choices, but within those choices, we can find some ways of doing things differently to try to set an example for others and be part of the solution rather than the problem. Other questions?
I pasted
a link to Arthur's book in the chat. And also our webinar next month is on the same topic of global governments to support social and economic development goals. So if you're interested in going further, there's 2 resources in the chat there for you. And I'd also like to invite any of the rest of you to participate in other ways. We've got the IEF institution, which was created by Arthur and is helped to be run by Christine and Laurent, also on this call. The dynamic trio of them also give several courses each year on environmental issues. In the spring, they conduct a course on climate change. And in the fall, they conduct a course on sustainability together, where you get even more of this kind of material. It's extremely thorough. And I'll put all those links in the chat for you. If you're interested in participating in this webinar series yourself, the email address is over there. And we're also looking for just 5-minute updates. We're going to do one webinar at some point in 2021 that is an update of a collection of 5-minute updates from all of you from around the world of just local initiatives that you're doing. And just share your successes and efforts with the rest of us.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for pointing out the Secretary General's talk. I saw that we've got to put this on the IF website. Haven't had a chance yet to actually say this is something that we need to publicize, because he's really hit the nail on the head with those things. Joachim I was on his doctoral committee, so he's in a sense been one of my students, so to speak. So this is passing it on to the next generation to carry these things further. So I encourage you to come and join the webinar next month as well.
All right, thanks everyone.
In fact, Joachim also won a prize from the Global Challenges Foundation in their educational programs for the things that he's been doing. And last Wednesday, I lectured to the course he's teaching on sustainability at the International University of Geneva. So we work very closely together. It's a small world, but we try to take things forward. So thank you all for joining us this evening. We hope that you weren't too bored by this, that it stimulated some thinking, and we'll encourage you to, in your own little way or big way, whatever it is, take these things further and help us to address the problems of the world. It's possible to fix the world. Don't think it's impossible. So thank you very much for being with us today, this evening, this morning. I hope that Todd didn't go to sleep at 3 in the morning or 3:30 in the morning, that you get a sense to catch up on your sleep later.
Thank you very much, Arthur and Kayla. It was wonderful, this webinar.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Okay, very good. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.